You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. When last we left Nehemiah, he was sitting on the floor of the Persian palace, 4 months deep into grief and prayer, having just heard that Jerusalem was in rubble and his people a laughingstock. And the natural thing, the thing that pretty much every sermon about Nehemiah wants to do, is turn this into a story about the power of prayer. Nehemiah prayed, and then God moved, and see how everything worked out. And look, I am not going to tell you that prayer isn't in this. Obviously it is. But I want to try a different angle here today. Because if we reduce Nehemiah to a prayer manual, we miss what is actually strange and unsettling in this story. We miss the politics. We miss the paranoia. We miss the genuine question of whether the main character is a hero or something considerably more complicated. So let's read chapter 2 carefully, and let's try not to assume that we already know what it's going to say. Let's read through chapter 2 of Nehemiah, and right now I'll just do the first 10 verses. The chapter is 20 verses, so we'll split it in half this way. So the first 10 verses read, "It came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him. I took up the wine, and gave it to the king. Now I had not been before sad in his presence. So the king said to me, 'Why is your countenance sad, seeing you aren't sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart.' And I was extremely afraid. And I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why shouldn't my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lies waste, and the gates of it are consumed with fire?' And the king said to me, 'Well, what's your request?' So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, 'If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you would send me to Judah, to the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it.' And the king said to me, the queen also sitting by him, 'For how long shall your journey be? And when are you planning to return?' So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. And on top of this, I said to the king, 'If it please the king, would you let letters be given to me to the governors beyond the river, that they could convey me over until I come to Judah? Oh, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he could give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which are by the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I will enter into.' And the king granted me, according to the good hand of my God upon me. And I came to the governors beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. And the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. Now when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel." Okay, verse 1. There's some grammar in this that's really hard to bring over into English, like particularly around the part where it says the wine was before him. It's hard to tell exactly what is being talked about there. Did the king already have wine? Was the wine in front of Nehemiah and he was taking it to the king? Was the king desiring wine that Nehemiah was about to bring? Ultimately, it doesn't really change what's being said in the verse. One way or the other, the king wanted wine, Nehemiah was the guy to get it, and he was about to bring it to the king. You may also notice, as we are wont to do here, bringing up the difference that the italicized words in Bibles can create, because you may notice that in verse 1 here, before time, as the King James has it, is italicized. And that's actually not in the Masoretic text tradition there. That is something that the King James is following a different variant with that added word. But it makes more sense to have it in there, because it is giving us the context that Nehemiah had not previously let his emotions slip out while he was at work. He was very stoic about this, for reasons that we will get to in a moment. So it has been 4 months since last week's chapter. We started in the month Kislev, roughly November to December, and now it's Nisan. Yes, it looks like Nissan. Once again, it has nothing to do with cars. Just kind of odd that we have 2 weeks in a row talking about ancient words, that we have cars now that have the same names, but no relations. So we are in the month Nisan, and that is mid-March to mid-April. The barley and flax harvests are coming in. The rains are here. It's turning to spring. And Nehemiah is still at this winter palace, still serving wine, still carrying this weight. But why did he wait for 4 months? Well, scholars have floated a few possibilities because the text does not give us a reason. One possible answer is that Artaxerxes maybe had spent the winter somewhere else this year and had just gotten to Susa now. There are ancient records of the kings sometimes staying in Babylon during those months. Another possibility comes from something called the Tukta. It was a Persian feast tradition in which kings were known to grant requests from their court, particularly around their birthdays. This is kind of what we see going on in Esther a little bit as well, so maybe that's what Nehemiah had in mind here. He may have been waiting for exactly the right political moment, the right context, the right atmospheric conditions for this kind of ask. Maybe he just assessed the mindset of the king in the months prior and determined he was not in the mood to be asked this sort of thing. So we don't know why it took 4 months, but here we are with Nehemiah 4 months later, finally before the king. And that detail matters because it tells us something about who Nehemiah is. He can be really calculating when he wants to be. He'll make some impulsive decisions at the end of the book. We'll get to that in due time. But overall, his actions consistently appear measured, like what we would expect of a politician, which he was. He has been sitting with this for 4 months. He has been paying attention to the rhythms of the court. Whatever happens next, it's calculated. Now, Artaxerxes. His name in the Hebrew text is quite a mouthful, as if Artaxerxes itself was not enough of a difficulty to pronounce. In the Hebrew text, it reads more like Artaxtatsta. You can tell that is not easy to say. But it was in and of itself a transliteration of Persian into Hebrew. The Greek historians are the ones who called him Artaxerxes. So when you see that name show up in your English Bibles, it's actually drawing on later translations and transliterations of the original Persian name, Artaxasta. However you choose to pronounce it, this is the same king that we met briefly back in Ezra 4 when we were laying the groundwork at the start of last week's episode. This is the same king who gave the executive order to shut down all work on Jerusalem years previously. This is the same king that Nehemiah is now about to approach and ask to please reverse that decision. So if you understand that, then Nehemiah's nervousness in the next verse makes a lot more sense. But there's another layer of context here that makes Artaxerxes specifically very interesting. It's the kind of thing your Bible intro never mentions. Artaxerxes came to power under circumstances that would give anyone serious trust issues. In 465 BCE, so a little over 20 years before all this is happening, his father Xerxes was assassinated. But not by some outside enemy, by Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard. He was one of the most trusted men in the empire, the man whose entire job was to keep the king alive. Now, ancient sources disagree on the exact sequence of events. Ctesias tells us one way, Aristotle another, but the broad outline is this. Artabanus murdered Xerxes, then manipulated the situation to frame Prince Darius. In some accounts, he even tricks Artaxerxes into killing his own brother. Now, the young Artaxerxes eventually pieces together what happens, turns on Artabanus, and has him killed. So the man who takes the throne has watched his father murdered by a bodyguard, watched his brother die, either by his own hand or Artabanus's, and spent the first years of his reign putting down revolts in Egypt and Bactria and the western satrapies. He has been king now for 2 decades when Nehemiah chapter 2 opens, and he is still on the throne, which actually says something. He is competent, and he has survived. But he did not get there by being naive about who around him might have a hidden agenda. So imagine that you are Artaxerxes here, the man who pours your wine, the person with the most direct physical access to what you put in your body, shows up looking distracted. The Message Bible translates verse 2 as, "So he asked me, 'Why the long face? You're not sick, are you? Or are you depressed?' That made me all the more agitated." Well, yeah, I would be agitated too. Like, my job here is literally to ensure that nothing gets into the king's cup that shouldn't be there. If I show up looking nervous and upset, one reasonable interpretation is that I know something's going on here and I'm too scared to tell the king. Maybe I was blackmailed or someone got to my family or something, right? So, the family history of the Persian throne is full of people who were killed by someone they trusted. Artaxerxes' own father is a case in point. So this is not some benevolent king asking a friend if he is okay. This is a very suspicious man with honestly pretty good reasons to be suspicious, asking the person closest to his food supply why they look like they're hiding something. And verse 3, Nehemiah, he doesn't deny his concerned look. He doesn't do what I think so many of us Christians would do and say, I'm fine, everything's fine. No, he leans into it. He sees the opportunity to actually voice some concerns, and he takes it. But notice what he says and what he doesn't say, or at least in what order he says them. In his first response in verse 3, he does not name Jerusalem. He says the city where his ancestors are buried. Now, according to the CSB Study Bible notes, this was most likely intentional because of the political baggage, the negative connotation that Jerusalem might carry in the king's mind from what happened back in Ezra chapter 4, where it had been described to the same king as a rebellious city with a history of causing problems for empires. So Nehemiah reframes the whole thing in terms that Artaxerxes would feel in his gut: ancestor veneration. Now, this is a matter of scholarly debate, but there are some scholars who believe that the Persian kings spent enormous resources on their family tombs. It was a deeply resonant cultural value. And Nehemiah knows that. He has been in this court for years, so he knows what heartstrings to tug on and how exactly to play his hand. In verse 4, the king then asks, well, what do you want? And Nehemiah prays. And this is one of those moments that the text just drops in like it's nothing. And that's kind of ironic to me, given how this verse gets focused on so much in evangelical and fundamentalist sermons on Nehemiah. This usually gets preached with an application that I think misses the point. Most sermons about this verse will turn it into an encouragement to pray without ceasing, which is fine. That's a thing. That's a different verse, different testament, but it's there. But then they immediately slide into treating this as a kind of spiritual technique. Pray first, then speak. Make prayer a habit long before you've actually gotten the opportunity to do something that you need to pray about. Here's what I'd like to highlight today. Nehemiah doesn't announce the prayer. He doesn't close his eyes or bow his head or do anything that would tip off the court that something devotional is happening. He is standing in front of the most powerful man in his world, having just been asked a direct question, likely implying doubts about his loyalty. And in the space between being asked and answering, he brings it somewhere. And I think the point of this was to give him more focus, not because this was some spiritual requirement where for God to act in the situation, he needed Nehemiah's quick intercession. No, I really don't believe that, because Nehemiah had been praying, apparently, for 4 months at this point. Now, maybe we're assuming a bit much because it doesn't say what exactly he did in that 4 months' time, but we do at least have him praying and going directly to God in the previous chapter. And prayer is a lot more about quality than it is quantity. So I don't think necessarily the point is that we have to immediately pray right before making a snap decision or something like that. I think if anything should be drawn out of this is noticing how reflexive it was to Nehemiah. Something quick, something short. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't full of these and thous. It was just a quick prayer. We don't know exactly for what. He doesn't say, but I would imagine maybe for clarity. And then he just goes on and makes his request. He doesn't belabor the point. I can think of one time I was at a party for someone, and there were a bunch of people there who were fundamentalist Christians and a bunch of people who were not Christian, or at least not evangelical. And probably about a third of a way through this meal, with a couple dozen people there, someone realized that the group had not prayed before they ate, interrupted everyone else, got up, said very loudly that they needed to pray, and found the closest fundamentalist leader nearby them to pray for the meal. That is performative. If you really have a desire to commune with God for some reason right before something happens, whether that be food or talking to the emperor of the known world at this time, well, that can be a private thing. It doesn't always have to be made into this big show for everyone else. In fact, I think Jesus had something to say about how prayer should be private rather than made a public display of. And that's one good thing that I actually see with Nehemiah here, is that the contrast is not about prayer versus no prayer. It's about performative faith versus an integrated one. There is a version of religion, the fundamentalism that I came from is a great example, that needs its piety visible, that needs the bow of the head, the closed eyes in public, the conspicuous devotion, the demanding that certain words not be used around me. All because at some level, the audience is still human. At that point, we were really talking to the people around us in the name of God more than we are actually talking to God. Rather than having the other people be bystanders in a conversation with God, we have brought them in and made the whole thing about how they are going to hear what I am saying. And at that point, I honestly think God becomes the bystander of the prayer. So the application here is not to give you a technique of pray before every little decision or thing that you say, but rather to instruct you that if you so desire having a little extra wisdom, a little extra comfort, a little extra focus on the matter, maybe just offer a quick moment of prayer and then trust that God's got it from there without needing you adding on anything else fancier. Verse 5 has me thinking an interesting thought here, and something that I don't really remember hearing brought up in sermons before. And it's this question: does Artaxerxes even know that Nehemiah is Jewish at this point? It's not a given. I mean, think of Esther's whole story, happening in this exact same palace, turns on the fact that her Jewish identity was hidden from the king. The father of the king in this story, Artaxerxes, his father Xerxes, reportedly didn't even know that Mordecai was Jewish. I mean, the Persian court was a multi-ethnic environment, and you didn't necessarily advertise your ethnic background. Now, from the time of Esther, things had gotten a little bit easier for the Judeans. They were able to live out their identity more publicly than they had 40-ish years before. But nothing here says that Nehemiah was completely open about his heritage. It is possible that when he mentions that he wants to go back to Judah here in verse 5, that's the first time Artaxerxes has realized Nehemiah is Judean. And verse 6 has this blink or you'll miss it detail that I think is honestly the most fascinating thing about this entire chapter, and one of the most fascinating things about the book as a whole. Let me reread verse 6 with you. The king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, for how long will your journey be, and when will you return? It's that little parenthesis, the queen also sitting by him. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know we try to take a very informed and inquisitive reading of the scriptures. So we should be asking questions, wondering who, what, where, when, how, asking about little details. When something shows up as a literal parenthesis in the verse, we should go, what made the author think that this detail was worth including? And oh boy, do I have a theory that will blow your socks off. You ready for this? Remember that the book of Esther took place roughly 40-ish years before the events that we have here today in Nehemiah. It's happening in the exact same place, possibly with the same person, but likely with father and son difference in who is king. Esther would have had Xerxes, Nehemiah likely has Artaxerxes now. And we have this little aside that the queen was sitting beside Artaxerxes. Who is this queen? Well, we don't know. The text doesn't say for sure. As per usual, Artaxerxes had multiple wives, and there's no indication which one it would be. However, the word translated queen here is a little flexible in what exactly it could mean. The Companion Bible notes that it is a Hebrew word borrowed actually from Akkadian originally, and it carries the nuance of great bride or possibly even foreign queen. And there are even some scholars who would translate it as queen mother. suggesting that perhaps the queen here was not the bride of Artaxerxes, but maybe his mother? Or at least a very powerful matriarch, wife of his father? Maybe a stepmother? Maybe, just maybe, a pretty old woman at this point whose name was Esther? It's not impossible. There's actually some ancient traditions, including the Septuagint, Josephus, the Midrash of Esther, that all identify the king of the Esther story not as Xerxes, but as Artaxerxes the First. Now, those sorts of timelines get funky really fast, and it's almost impossible to have the same king in the book of Esther as you have in the book of Nehemiah. However, if the traditional understanding that Esther was married to Xerxes and Nehemiah's king was Artaxerxes, Esther could have still possibly been alive at this time. Now, she likely would have been in her, I'm going to say, mid to late 50s at least here, if this truly is her in the book. And that may not sound like a lot to us now, but in the ancient world, she'd be getting up there in years. There is no way that we can prove for sure that the queen mentioned here is Esther. I'll be honest with you. I'll be blunt. There is no way we can know it for sure. But I cannot think of another good reason why we have this aside of the queen sitting next to the king, if it is not intending for us to think of Esther. I could be totally wrong here. This is not a very popular scholarly opinion that the queen here would be Esther. I'm in the minority for thinking this, but it really makes sense to me. And I think it helps to make sense of why Nehemiah gets what he wants. Nehemiah gets the perfect audience for his request. And verse 7, he asks for the king not only to send him, but also to send him with all expenses paid and a nice security crew along with him. He isn't just asking to go home. He is asking for a diplomatic travel packet for what was likely a 900-mile journey through multiple Persian provinces. Remember, you are not just traveling in a straight line. This is not about drawing a straight line from Susa to Jerusalem. You had to follow a curve around the rivers. You weren't just going to walk all that way across desert. You weren't going to make it. So he has a really, really lengthy journey here. Probably something that is at least the distance from New York to Atlanta, if not longer. And these are not open territories. These are tightly administered satrapies, each with their own governor, each with their own security apparatus. You can't just ride your way through. You would need authorization at every checkpoint. And again, this is not like modern-day nations where they had clearly established borders, but you were going to run across government officials and security that required you have a reason for being where you were. So Nehemiah requests all that. And he also asks for a letter to Asaph. That's a Jewish name, and that may mean that this person was another exile who had also risen through Persian ranks. He controlled the royal timber supply, and Nehemiah needed material to rebuild the gates, the citadel by the temple, and his own residence. So he asks for this Asaph to supply him with a ridiculous amount of wood. Now, the specific word used as a really fascinating detail I want to pull out here in verse 8, and it's that the word used for forest, Nehemiah requested a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. That is not initially a Hebrew word. It is a loan word from Persian that you will recognize based on English the second I say it. Paradis. Paradise. The word for forest, it's actually more like garden. And can you maybe think of any other garden that could have a connection with a word like paradise? How about the Garden of Eden? In fact, that word does get used of Eden later on in the Septuagint when the Tanakh is translated into Greek. So this seems like a really strange wording choice. Let's talk to the keeper of the king's paradise, of his royal botanical gardens. Why are we going to him? Why use that exact word? Well, maybe to suggest that Nehemiah is getting ready to build a new, renewed Eden in Jerusalem. There's those Genesis hyperlinks that always show up every time. You know we can't get through an episode without referencing Genesis 1 through 6. That is how the Bible works. It's so cool. I love it. So he goes to get the timber from Asaph, and he says he needs to build the house. Now, it's not exactly clear what house is in view there. Some believe that it was Solomon's house. Some are thinking the military citadel that had been part of the temple. Others are thinking just part of the temple itself. It's definitely not referring to Nehemiah's personal home when he's using the word house there. But whatever it is, it's part of the building projects in the general temple vicinity. Now, a lot of English versions, particularly newer ones, will capitalize beyond the river as a province marker. Now, if you're reading in the Old King James, you'll notice it's not capitalized. In some older versions like that, they'll just have the words beyond the river in lowercase. But more modern ones capitalize it as if that is actually the title of the province. Some will even translate it as the Trans-Jordan. Basically, the idea is that as translation has improved, we have come to realize with some archaeology and just other biblical history from that time that the region to the right of the Jordan River, if you're looking at a map, so not the Israel part, but the part that they came from, so the opposite side of the Jordan River, that is its own province that is possibly called Beyond the River. That would have been the name of it. Or Trans-Jordan should be relatively obvious, across the Jordan. So that's why that area is sometimes going to be given a proper name in more modern Bibles. And here's where we have to hold two very different explanations for why Artaxerxes agrees to go along with this, in addition to possibly having influence from his queen mother. The devotional reading that you'll get in a lot of books, sermons, commentaries, is that God moved the king's heart. And it would be both unfair and inaccurate to say flat out that is not what the text may be intimating. Nehemiah himself attributes the king's favorable response to the hand of God. He believed that. That's how he wrote it. But the Faith Life Study Bible raises a different explanation that's worth sitting in. Artaxerxes may have had a perfectly pragmatic reason to say yes as well. And we introduced this back in our first episode in the series. The Judean region was a natural buffer zone in an empire under stress. There had been a major revolt in Egypt in the 450s BCE. The empire's western provinces were a little unstable. Having someone as trusted and competent as Nehemiah installed as a local governor in Judea, rebuilding a city that could function as a fortified outpost of Persian loyalty, that made complete common sense from a security standpoint. The IVP Bible Background Commentary makes the same observation. The turbulence of Artaxerxes' reign meant the Persians had real incentive to cultivate loyalty among minority groups within the empire. High-ranking Judeans like Nehemiah were probably not coincidental. So which is it? Divine providence or realpolitik? Nehemiah doesn't seem to think those are mutually exclusive. And honestly, they might not be. The same event can be both a political calculation and a theological moment when both are treated respectfully. The text isn't bothered by holding them both. But here's the thing that should make us at least pause. Artaxerxes was the one who issued the order to stop building in the first place. His permission is the only reason this project can happen at all. Nehemiah's mission from the very start is embedded deeply in this very political structure. So keep that in mind as we continue our study. Verse 9 indicates that Nehemiah had a military escort. The king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. That's really fascinating, and something that no one ever draws out. So, of course, we're going to pause here for a minute. Because there's another passage that comes to mind with a similar situation that goes very differently. And that's Ezra chapter 8, verses 21 to 23. Let me read those for you. So this is Ezra speaking, and he says, I proclaimed a fast there, at the river Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right way for us, and for our little ones, and for all our substance, because I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way, because we'd spoken to the king, saying the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and wrath is against all them that forsake him. So we fasted and besought our God for this, and he was entreated of us. So in Ezra 8, we very clearly have Ezra refusing a military escort because he told the king that God would protect them and felt it would look bad to then ask for soldiers. And here we are in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 9, where he very happily accepts these soldiers from the king. So we have two different people with two very different convictions here in basically the same circumstance. And oddly enough, there is no indication that either text is judging either man. There is no statement from on high that says, yes, Ezra was being faithful and Nehemiah needed more faith in my ability to protect them. Or saying, Ezra was stupid. He's lucky he made it out there alive. He should have asked for guards, and Nehemiah was smart. We don't get either of those. And that's really important to me, because it shows that we have two different sets of ways of looking at the world that I would say are heavily influenced by theology and what we expect from God, and yet they are put side by side in literally the same book. Because remember, Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book, so it's not even like we have to go to two different books to see these two different portrayals of what could be pleasing to God. We see them happening just chapters away from each other in the same scroll, with no judgment being given of who was correct. So that tells me that what is faithful for one person in one moment can look completely different from someone else in a different time and place. The fundamentalism in which I grew up would be happier with Ezra's answer, because it seems to show more faith in God, to suggest that I don't need soldiers, I don't need protection, I just need God to get me there, okay? We were obsessed about what we called standards, the way that we tried to live our life. And the assumption was always that whoever had the highest, most restrictive standards possible was getting closer to God. There were plenty of people that I knew growing up who were not allowed to watch R-rated movies at all. That was just a line in the sand. And then there were some that I knew that were. There were some who were uncomfortable watching PG-13 movies. I knew Christians who refused to watch movies with any cursing in them at all. I even knew preachers who would go around yelling about having a TV in the first place. Now, those arguments kind of went out the window once we were able to stream things on our phones, but we were always pushed. Not always explicitly, but it was implicit, and sometimes it was actually said out loud, that it's better to have a stricter standard. So if you were one of those families that was, let's just say, in the middle, right? You would watch PG-13 movies that had some cursing, but you wouldn't watch R. Well, as soon as someone comes along who either says, I don't watch movies with any cursing, or I don't watch movies at all, which, as ridiculous as that's going to sound to some of you listening, there were actually Christians in our circles in the 2000s that would go that far. And once they publicly voiced those opinions, particularly if it was a preacher from behind a pulpit, all of a sudden everyone with a less restrictive standard, even if it was still really restrictive, like only watching PG-13 or below, they suddenly started to feel guilted about it, pressured to change what they believed was right solely because somebody else had a more restrictive standard. And I think that having these passages so close indicates that that was the wrong mindset entirely. It is totally okay for two different people serving the same God, eventually working together in just a few more chapters here, we'll see, and yet come to totally different convictions. And not only come to different convictions, but still respectfully work together despite that. It is immature to believe that everyone else needs to have the same standard as you, or to start pushing your standards on other people. Now, it's okay if a conversation comes up and someone's asking you why, and you share why you have a particular belief. Sure. But don't have this fundamentalist mindset that says the most restrictive way is best. Not when we have Jesus coming along saying that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Not when we have New Testament writers saying that God's Spirit follows a law of liberty that frees us. Don't fall for the fundamentalist sin. Instead, follow Scripture and trust that God can lead different people different ways, and that's okay. All right, we now have Sanballat and Tobiah in verse 10. These guys are going to become significant characters, so let's actually meet them properly now. Sanballat the Horonite. His name appears in the Elephantine Papyri, the same documents we talked about last week, as a governor of Samaria. So he is not some random local troublemaker. He is a Persian provincial official with real administrative authority. And Horonite most likely means that he was from Horonaim, a city in Moab, the part of the Transjordan across the Dead Sea from Judah. So that means that one of the primary antagonists of this story is a Moabite. And if that's ringing a bell, it should. Moab is all over the Old Testament. It's where Balak came from, the king who tried to hire Balaam to curse Israel during the Exodus, which went famously badly for him in ways involving prophetic visions, a broken leg, and a talking donkey. Normal Tuesday afternoon. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Micah all have things to say about Moab, none of it complimentary, of course. But more importantly, what is the origin story of Moab as a nation? Well, you have to go to Genesis 19 for that. Lot escapes Sodom and Gomorrah with his 2 daughters. His wife is already gone. The daughters, believing that they are the last people on earth, initiate an incestuous relationship with their father, basically raping him. Both daughters then have sons. The older daughter's son is named Moab. That's where the nation comes from in the biblical story. So you have these biblical authors who are going, yeah, there's this tribe nearby us that, we really don't like. We keep getting in tussles with them and we don't always win. How can we describe the way that this nation came about? How about we say they're a bunch of backwater hicks who came about through incest? That is exactly what the biblical authors did in their presentation of Moab. So when a Horonite shows up opposing Nehemiah, this is the genealogy that you should have in mind. Interestingly enough, though, Sanballat's sons are also listed in those papyri, and they have theophoric names. Now, that is a fancy scholarly word to say that within somebody's name, there is a divine name. So it's like when you have a name that ends in the letters EL or YAH, or in English it'll often be IAH or JAH. That's the Yah, the name, the first few letters of the name for God, or El being the word for God. So whenever you have El or Yah or something along those lines showing up in a person's name in the Bible, that is theophoric. It has part of God's name or title in that person's name. So Sanballat has children whose names have Yahweh's name in them. That indicates that Sanballat was a Yahweh worshiper. You're not going to give your kid a name with Yah in it in this time period unless you are already a worshiper of Yahweh. That complicates things. It keeps him from being this one-dimensional villain that we often portray him as. Similarly, Tobiah the Ammonite, his name also ends with a theophoric suffix, IAH, Tobiah, as in Yahweh. So Tobiah is, by his very name, someone who is at least nominally identified with Yahweh worship. He may have been from an Ammonite family that had assimilated into the Sumerian community and picked up Yahwistic religion. That, again, puts us in complicated territory. He is not a straightforward pagan villain. This is someone adjacent to the tradition, on the margins of Nehemiah's very own tradition, operating from his own set of interests. There's also a reasonable chance that Tobiah, is connected with the Tobiad family, a powerful dynasty that had been around since the Assyrian conquest, and which would continue causing headaches all the way into the Maccabean period after Nehemiah. Regardless, Sanballat and Tobiah, they weren't nobodies, and they weren't mustache-twirling villains. Now, the text tells us that when they heard about Nehemiah coming, it grieved them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of Israel. And we read that and go, well, how bad do you have to be to find helping someone else to be evil, right? Well, hold that thought, because there are other ways to read this that we need to get into. But first, let's finish reading the chapter so we get the rest of the context. This is Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. So I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, but I didn't tell anyone what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. And there wasn't even any beast with me, except for the beast that I rode on. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, to the dung port. I viewed the walls of Jerusalem which were broken down, and the gates of which were consumed with fire. I went on to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there wasn't any place for the beast under me to pass. I went up by night to the brook, and I viewed the wall, and turned back, and I entered then by the gate of the valley, and so I returned. And the rulers didn't know where I went or what I did. Neither had I told it to the Judeans, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, or to the rest that did the work. So I said to them, you see the distress we're in, how Jerusalem lies waste and the gates of it are burned with fire? Come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. And I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken to me. And they said, let's rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what's this thing you're doing? Are you going to rebel against the king? And I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, no right, no memorial in Jerusalem. Verses 12 through 15 describe Nehemiah's nighttime inspection of the walls. He goes out quietly, just a few people, no announcement. He traces the perimeter. He starts at the valley gate, goes past the dragon's well, toward the dung gate, around the fountain gate, up along the king's pool, then back the same way because the rubble is so thick the animal he's riding on can't get through. And you're probably going, oh, I'm so glad you just gave me all those place names. That helps me so much visualize what's going on. Right? Right, guys? Right? I have a feeling I'd be hearing crickets. Yeah. Your Bible probably doesn't dwell on this particular set of verses. It is just logistical setup for the reconstruction project that follows. But we can get a good idea of the path that he is taking. See, the gates of the valley are what leads to the valley of Hinnom, or Gehinnom, or what you may know as Gehenna. He is right alongside hell. Gehenna usually gets translated as hell in our New Testaments. You can check out our Eternal Rest Stop series for more on why this word doesn't actually mean hell as we think of it. But this is the inspiration for where our modern ideas of hell have come from. So he is wandering along hell here. He has gotten to this valley gate. And then he goes to the dragon's well, which some translations will have as the jackal's well or also the serpent's well. It's a word that if you have listened to our Genesis 1 through 6 series, you may recognize. Tanin, sea serpents. Now, we don't know exactly what this gate was. The Cornerstone Biblical Commentary notes that it is nowhere else identified in Scripture. And it says that some hypothesize the well could refer to the spring of En Rogel, which is past the southern tip of the wall where Hinnom and Kidron valleys meet. But that doesn't seem likely since that's after where the dung gate is, the third landmark. Some suggest that maybe it's even Hezekiah's tunnel, but we can't know for sure, and that kind of seems a little unlikely to me. Although maybe it would make sense with the slithering kind of going back and forth a little bit of the tunnel. Hard to tell. Next up, Nehemiah goes to the dung port, which seems to be an old trash dump area. So what he is doing is he's starting at the northwest corner of the city, top left side, and he is going southeast following the wall. Now, you can't think of biblical cities in terms of medieval square or circular castles. That is really reading into the Bible a Western mindset that wasn't there. Jerusalem is really small at this point, and the perimeter of it was shaped. Honestly, the first thing that comes to my mind is like a spatula, where it has this kind of squarish section on top that narrows into a very thin area on the bottom. So just think big and square at the top, really long and narrow the rest of the way. Some artist renderings even have it looking kind of like the shape of New Jersey or a reversed California. So as Nehemiah walks down the perimeter, he sees walls that are broken down, the gates consumed with fire. Broken down is very forceful terminology. It almost has the idea of being ruptured. And consumed has the same meaning it does today. It literally means the gates were eaten up with fire. Now, there's no clarification, I think, on where exactly he was at each of these points, because they would have been no-duh moments to the people hearing the book read at this time. They didn't need an explanation, and the biblical authors weren't really concerned with how people after their generation were going to read these texts. That's why sometimes you have later editors coming in and saying, oh, the place they were talking about is actually called XYZ thing to this day, because we needed a note to remind us of what that place was. And now we need even more notes because more time has gone on. The things that seem clear to us are often not clear to everyone else around us, and definitely not after our generation. It's amazing how quickly names and places change, and we have to have little notes that explain what the connection from back then to now is. So this is Nehemiah's first time seeing his homeland. I want you to really stop and think about this. He was likely born, raised, and now past midlife in a completely different land. And everything that his parents and probably grandparents had told him about their homeland, it's all superseded by his first impressions of his home. Charred bricks. They're the first part of his home that he ever touched. Imagine what he'd be feeling as he walks along and touches those bricks. I mean, imagine if your parents and grandparents lived in, I'll just say Philadelphia, since that's close to where I am, and they get deported to a foreign country. And while over there, you're born. And as an adult, you get a chance to go back to your homeland of Philadelphia. But when you get there, the first thing you see is the ruin of a city with some makeshift buildings from the past 40 years. That doesn't really match the stories you were told at all. That's how Nehemiah is feeling right now. He was born in exile. His parents were exiles. He grew up in the Persian Empire. He spent probably a good bit of his adult life in the court at Susa. He had never once set foot in Jerusalem before this journey. The city he's been weeping and praying over for 4 months. The city his entire identity is built. The city that lives in the stories and the scriptures and the memories of his people. He's seeing it for the first time tonight. Man, get the right actor and this scene could be Oscar bait. Because as he looks at the wreckage, it's so extensive that it stops his mount. The gates have been eaten by fire. The walls aren't just broken, they're ruptured. This is a city torn open. His ancestors' stories had described this place as the navel of the world, the place where heaven and earth met, the location of the temple where God put his name. And what Nehemiah is walking through in the dark, reaching out his hand to touch the scorched stones, is the aftermath, the actual rubble of all that. I don't know a lot of what to say of how that moment could have felt without flattening it. So I don't even want to try. I just want to note that the text does something interesting here. The silence stands out to me because we don't get any kind of reaction out of him. No prayer now, no weeping, no recorded emotional response at all. The man who lamented for 4 months at a distance gets to the city and goes quiet. Maybe he already used up the tears. Maybe there's some things that just get walked through in silence. It's a difficult moment for him. But if Ezra is presented as the new Moses to the new people, Nehemiah is presented as the new Joshua. And the language of verse 15 is very similar to how the enemies of Joshua heard and reacted to him in the first chapter of that story. But in verses 16 to 18, Nehemiah decides to come clean with the people. So he addresses the Judeans, the priests, the nobles, the rulers, the rest that did the work. The nobles there, that probably doesn't mean whatever you have in your mind. At least if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking like medieval court kind of nobles, all fancy dressed and all that. Really, it just means citizens with rights. Because back then, not every citizen had rights. So essentially, all these different titles are a way of saying he gathered together everyone that was there. And the point of his doing this after everything is not to teach you that it is good to hide information from people you are leading. Remember, this is not a leadership manual. The Bible doesn't weigh in on whether Nehemiah was right or wrong in his actions. Maybe he was right, and there is some information that not everyone there needed to know. Maybe the people there were not very trustworthy. Maybe he was unsure yet of how he was going to do it, and he wanted a full plan before he shared it. Or maybe he was wrong, and he would have had better support and less opposition if he had included more people earlier. Remember, it is not a how-to manual on leadership. It is a historical record of how one man led. We are never told to copy every action he took. We are expected, however, to learn from his actions, be they good or bad. In one circumstance, this might be a good course of action to withhold some information. In many circumstances, that could be a bad and even dishonest course of action. But we have to judge that based on our own set of circumstances. In verse 17, he rallies the people, points to the rubble, points to the shame. He says, we can do something about this. And he brings genuine energy with him. Verse 18 has the people rising up and building and the work beginning. He's definitely a glass half full kind of guy. Like, I can think of how evangelicals would have seen the rubble of the homeland as a sign of God's hand being against them. But Nehemiah chooses to defy that and trust that despite everything, God's not angry with us. We can still rebuild. And I can't help but think that he is being influenced by Isaiah 35 here as well. Let's pause and take a quick break here because I have a question I want to bring up that may make us a little uncomfortable. I want to give us a chance to take a deep breath, get a drink of water, whatever we may need, and come back to this. As we do this study, I want you to notice how often God is invoked in the book versus how many times God responds and actually gives his explicit divine sanction. I'm going to spoil it for you because we still have several chapters to go, but if you agree to keep me honest through the study, if you see something different, I'm going to tell you right now that God never once actually speaks for himself or endorses any actions in this book. Now, Nehemiah continues to claim that, but we have other passages of Scripture where people, even good people, claim that God wanted them to do something that he apparently didn't. I think even of Saul, not King Saul, but like Apostle Paul, who thought he was serving God while doing horrible things like killing Christians. Nehemiah is playing the role of the serpent here, asking, yeah, but did God really say we couldn't protect ourselves with a wall just because he wanted a Jerusalem where all are welcome, like he said in Zechariah? When I believe I'm right, especially about theology, about God, about religion, my actions, even the harsh ones, become justified. We see this happen in politics. We see it happen in churches. This is why we can't ever assume that we are getting everything right. Plenty of prophets claim to speak for God in the Bible. Some of them are called out directly as false. And others, you have to look at how the rest of Scripture, the rest of Revelation, not the book, but of Revelation as a whole, what God has revealed to us as humans, lines up with what they are saying. And Nehemiah flunks that test big time. We have spent the first couple weeks of this study watching the returning exiles frame themselves as the true Israel, the real inheritors of the covenant, the purified remnant who came back from Babylon and are going to get things right this time. And Nehemiah's project is the physical expression of that framing. A wall around Jerusalem is not just infrastructure, it's a border. It's a definition of who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't. And the people Nehemiah defines as being outside the bounds of acceptable belief, the Sanballats, the Tobiahs, the Samaritans, the mixed populations that had been living in and around that land for decades while the exiles were gone, they have their own version of this story. Peter Bedford, in his work on diaspora homeland relations in Ezra Nehemiah, made an observation worth sitting with. It's the tension between the returnees, Nehemiah's people, and the peoples of the land, the Judeans and similar people groups who had been there while Nehemiah was still away in Babylon. Haggai and Zechariah describe the same time period. Haggai and Zechariah, written about the same restoration, the same time period as Nehemiah, they are contemporaries. They do not present this ethnic friction at all. Zechariah includes both groups in the rebuilding without indicating any conflict whatsoever. Both the people who were still in the land and the ones who are just coming in with Nehemiah. He doesn't present them as having conflict. And then there's Zechariah 2:5, which we talked about in week 1, written during this same post-exilic period, where the prophetic vision is explicitly of many nations joining themselves to Yahweh and becoming his people. The wall Zechariah envisions for Jerusalem in chapter 2 is not a stone wall. It is a wall of fire, and it's specifically set in the context of a Jerusalem so full of people and animals that it cannot be contained by physical boundaries at all. That's the prophetic tradition Nehemiah's contemporaries were also reading. And Nehemiah is building something that functionally contradicts it. So contrary to the common church interpretation of these texts that just assumes because it's in the Bible, it means this is what God wanted, we need to pause and be nuanced and realize that that sort of approach would have you believing everything that Satan ever says in Scripture. Now, we need to consider whether or not God is actually endorsing these actions. And we need to ask, is the wall faithful or is it fear-driven? Is it something that we should be cheering on or maybe even emulating today? Or is it something that we should see as not being a proper understanding of what God wanted here? Here's what I think is true on one side. To be completely fair, the returning community was genuinely vulnerable. They were a small group, they were politically weak, surrounded by people with competing interests, trying to maintain a distinct identity under imperial rule. The wall was real protection for real people. The instinct to define a protected space is not in and of itself automatically wrong. But here's what I think is also true on the other side. Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, they are not cartoonish villains. They are regional administrators with legitimate political concerns. A newly fortified Jerusalem with a powerful Persian-backed governor changes the balance of power in the region, particularly if it happens as quickly as Nehemiah wants us to believe. These are people who have had stable arrangements, who have built lives and communities and governance structures in the years the exiles were away. And now someone comes in with royal backing and starts drawing hard lines around who does or doesn't have a share in this place, regardless of how long we've been here versus how quickly he just showed up. These concerns start to make a lot more sense. And it seems like Sanballat may have been either a family name or possibly a title, because there appears to be multiple Sanballats that we have historical record of. And it's no wonder that they hated what the returning Judeans were doing after how Ezra had treated them previously. They were the cousins that were cut out of the family. And for Geshem, we may have a few historical references as well. There is a 5th century BCE Aramaic inscription from Egypt that references Qanu, the son Gashmu, the king of Kedar. Even just a quick wiki search on him shows that the Kedarites were one of the leading Arab groups in this period. And there is also a contemporary account and a king list from Dedan that mentions Gashmu. That seems to possibly be the same as this Geshem. So it's possible that Geshem the Arabian is actually a Kedarite king. Tobiah, we already mentioned, is possibly from the Tobiad line, but he's presented as a descendant of Hagar. And you have the bad blood going all the way back to Abraham with Isaac and Ishmael. There's a lot of Hatfields and McCoys kind of stuff going on here. These people often get framed as villains, but they're likely regional leaders with legitimate political concerns. Jerusalem being rebuilt could destabilize existing power structures. In other words, Nehemiah may not be the underdog hero. He might be a disruptive political actor. I mean, imagine if you had worked hard to get some stability for your tribe, and then suddenly some random bureaucrat comes in and starts fortifying a nearby city. You'd probably be concerned too. In verse 20, Nehemiah's response to them has some humor in it, because he says that the God of heaven will prosper us. And that word prosper means to break through something. And this is happening at the same time that they are building up the walls. So I see like a contrast in that he's using a word for breaking through as they are building. And when he says that they have no portion, right, or memorial, those are specific legal categories. They are inheritance rights, juridical standing, and religious participation. Nehemiah isn't just saying, you're not welcome here. He is using the language of covenant community to make a formal legal exclusion. You have no share, no claim, you don't belong here. To the people standing on the other side of that line is not just a theological statement, it is a dispossession of everything they had. And here's the thread I want to lay down that we'll pick back up through this series. Nehemiah is doing all of this in the name of God. He attributes every positive outcome to divine providence. He frames every opposition as an attack on God's purposes. He is entirely convinced he is right. But remember, God never actually speaks in the book. Not once. Nehemiah prays throughout it. His prayers are answered, at least in the sense that some of them work out. But God does not endorse Nehemiah's actions directly. No voice from heaven appears and says, yes, build the wall, exclude these people, that's what I really want. Nehemiah asserts divine sanction. He is certain of it. But again, wasn't Paul also certain that he was serving God while hunting down Christians? People are certain of a lot of things in the name of God. Now, that's not automatically proof that Nehemiah was wrong about everything, but it is an argument for holding his certainty with a little more tension than the text usually gets. And the prophetic tradition, Zechariah's vision of a Jerusalem so alive that it spills past its own walls, of many nations joining themselves to Yahweh, of a community defined not by boundary markers, but by presence. That vision is sitting right here in the same religious set of texts. And that one is depicted as a direct message from God. Nehemiah would have been aware of these prophets. He has prayed Deuteronomy. He knows his sacred texts. So did he hear Zechariah's message and just disagree with it? Did he think the wall was a temporary measure until the universal vision Zechariah predicted could happen? Did he not see any tension in the message at all? We don't know. And the text doesn't tell us. And maybe that dissonance is the point. It shows how arguably good people can serve the same God and end up in completely contradictory places. And both those positions are preserved in our sacred texts without much commentary about which option is preferred. So what do we do in cases like this? Well, we have to look to the whole narrative of Scripture to determine which positions best match the larger portrait of God we are given. And I am thoroughly convinced that Zechariah's message matches God's vision a lot better than Nehemiah's does. Chapter 2 ends before the building actually begins. Now, Nehemiah has his permission, he's surveyed the damage, he's made his case to the people, and he has named his opposition. So all the chess pieces are on the table. And the work will begin in the next chapter. But we leave this one with open questions that the rest of the book is going to have to wrestle with. When we claim divine sanction for our projects, beliefs, statements, social media posts, doctrines, sermons, how do we stay honest about what we might be missing? When does protection become exclusion? When does faithfulness to one community become a wound to another? And when our walls go up, who are we preventing from seeing inside? Those are the questions that Jesus and the rest of Scripture lead us to ask of Nehemiah and also ourselves. See you next time when we read through chapter 3. But until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.